So good evening and welcome to New Administration, Old Laws, Observations from Immigration Court. Tonight's event is part of the Advocates for Human Rights virtual human rights event series. And so you can find out more about the event series. We will have a slide at the end to tell you what all is coming up, but you can find that at our website, theadvocatesforhumanrights.org/fall21. And we're glad to have you with us this evening. My name is Michelle Garnett McKenzie. I'm a Deputy Director here at the Advocates for Human Rights, and it is really my pleasure to welcome you this evening. Tonight, we will hear from Amy Lang, who is the coordinator of the Immigration Court Observation Project, and from two of our court observers, Sharon Castle and Susan Cope. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. We've got everyone muted so that we're all able to hear the presenters during the evening, but we will be taking questions at the end. So please feel free, if you want to memorialize your question, put it in chat, let us know, and we'll let people ask questions at the end. We are also recording tonight, so feel free to turn off your camera if you prefer to do that. Finally, the work you are going to hear about tonight is really just not possible without financial support. You can support this work by making a donation. Simply text Observer to 44321. That's Observer to 44321, or click on the link that will be shared in the chat to donate. Thank you so much for joining us. And as we get started, I would like to just let you know a little bit about the Advocates for Human Rights. We are a multi-issue international human rights organization. We're headquartered here in downtown Minneapolis, where the bells are ringing. We were founded in 1983 and envision a world where every person can live with dignity, justice, equality, freedom, and peace. We work to protect human rights on the individual level. Last year, we provided legal help in more than 1,100 immigration cases. And we also work on the systems level. We released more than 36 reports last year, partnered with dozens of human rights organizations worldwide and in our home community to report on rights violations and, importantly, to advocate for policy change to end those violations. The Immigration Court Observation Project is an essential part of that work because it documents what is going on on the front lines of the immigration enforcement mechanism, and it makes sure that we can figure out what we can do to change things right away, what we can do to change things through legal policy change, and what we can do to transform our community and make it a more welcoming place. Finally, we believe that we all have a part to play in protecting and defending human rights. Last year, we engaged more than 1,300 volunteers in human rights work. Among them were hundreds of immigration court observers and observers in our WATCH program, the sibling program to the the Immigration Court Project that monitors hearings in district court affecting violence against women cases. Now, as we move into talking about the Immigration Court Observation Project's findings for this year, we wanted to anchor things in really what our vision for immigration policy is here at the Advocates. And this is truly informed by the work of the court observers over the last several years, documenting the proceedings in immigration court, taking a look at people whose lives are being upended because they are in detention and facing exile from the United States with no path to ever getting their status regularized, to ever becoming fully integrated into the civic life of the United States where they've built their homes, facing permanent exile from family. All of these things, these injustices, really informed the principles that we are pushing to advocate that our immigration law reflect. And really at the heart of that is designing an immigration system that people can actually navigate, that allows people to get status or stay in status. Right now, most of our immigration law is a big trap full of potholes that you can fall in. If you don't file a form on time, you file the wrong form, you don't put the fee in the right place, you don't get a notice or keep your address updated. Any number of things can have you become undocumented. And there's virtually no way to go from undocumented into status. That doesn't make any sense. And we see how that imperils the rights of people to live their lives and thrive every day at the immigration court, where people just simply have no way to fix their immigration status. We also really think that if we are going to have a system, it has to be invested in fairly adjudicating cases and making decisions that are made on time, that give people a fair day in court, that allow them to make their case and have the rights under the law that do exist. Right now, we just don't have that. We don't have lawyers for everybody in court. We don't have a right to an immigration attorney when you're facing deportation. We have a system of courts and other sort of decision makers that is so severely underfunded compared to the vast number, tens of thousands of enforcement agents who are in the immigration system. That lack of balance means that people really get pushed through a system at a racing pace, or if they're not in detention, can languish for years in a backlog before ever getting a decision. Neither of those are fair, and we have to make sure that people have a fair day in court. We've also really come to see, I think, in a heartbreaking way, the impact of relying on systems of criminalization and incarceration that are designed specifically to exclude and expel people from the United States. That's what strikes people in the face when they walk into immigration court to be an observer. And it's something that's reinforced throughout the system. And too often people who are facing deportation are actually facing return to countries where they will experience human rights violations. That's against the law. The international law is clear that that is not something we are allowed to do, and yet we do it every day. So that's another core principle that we're looking at. And finally, what system do we want to make for people living in the world? Make sure that people are able to work and not free from exploitation, not kind of ground through systems that depend on their being in an exploitable class of people. Making sure that our communities are inclusive and welcoming and that allow us to thrive rather than sowing division, rather than driving us apart. And finally, ensuring that people have human rights protections. They have families, they're individuals, community members, wherever they are, whether they're in their country of origin, in transit to the United States, or here in our country. People are human beings and have the fundamental human rights, no matter who they are, just inherent in being a human being. So that's sort of where we come from at the Advocates in our immigration work, and why the Immigration Court Observation Project is so important to us. I'm going to be turning things over to Amy now, but invite you to join us. There's a QR code on your screen that if you snap a picture, you should be able to get to our volunteer form, and that will allow you to kind of get started if you haven't yet been able to observe immigration court and you live here in the Twin Cities metro area. But really, just be part of learning, of knowing, and of bearing witness, and of advocating for changes that really respect international human rights standards and make sure that we live up to our most fundamental values in this country. So with that, Amy, I think I'll turn things over to you, and you can talk about the Immigration Court Project and what's going on in immigration court right now.
Thanks, Michelle. So I'm Amy Lang, and I'm the coordinator of the project on behalf of the Advocates for Human Rights. And the project started about 4.5 years ago, really as a pilot, after the first Muslim ban was announced and people were outraged. And as the project continued, it became clear that it could really have impact, as Michelle said, some in changing behavior of the players in the courtroom, and some in lobbying or guiding or giving feedback to policymakers, and also in working fairly seamlessly with attorneys in helping them support some of these people who wouldn't otherwise have representation. So since it started, we've had over 700 people volunteer in court. And I think we've submitted and analyzed over 14,000 observations, which is a lot. Now, sometimes there's multiple people watching a case because we want to see how people perceive the same cases, and we want to make sure that we cover all the cases that we're trying to see. So that's not necessarily 14,000 individuals that were observed, but 14,000 submissions. Our goal is to observe all the hearings for people who are detained in immigration court, because we feel like those who are detained who've lost their liberty have face many more barriers in having a fair day in court. So, Michelle, if we could go to the next slide. I want to say a bit about the topic for this tonight. New administration, old laws. There was a lot of hope with the new administration that things would change dramatically. Some of that is because they need to, and some of it is misunderstanding what is really possible. So things change partly by executive action, partly by regulatory rulemaking, which has a process, and partly by legislative change. And Congress has enacted nothing. So we still face most of the same barriers we faced under the last administration. This is just a picture to show that in immigration court, we see cases for people from North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota. And the little dots are just the various places that people might be held in jail or in prison that we are seeing in court. And if you'd show the next slide, Michelle. This is a picture of just where the sites are in the near the metro. So we're seeing people who are being held in ICE detention. We're seeing cases for people who are serving out sentences for a criminal conviction, but are simultaneously in deportation proceedings. So these are some of the places that they're held. You can go to the next slide, Michelle. And nobody will be able to see this, but basically this is a picture that those of you who are our court observers will recognize. But every person will fill out basically a form for every hearing they witness, and people are hearing anywhere between 1 and 8 hearings anytime they go to court. So some of these are really rapid fire. And there's a 2-page form with a lot of lines and check boxes. So people are trying to gather information that's really quantifiable and demographic, like what country are they from? What gender is this person? Do they have an attorney or not? And then things that are more subjective, including some things that are purely subjective, like, did you think this was fair? Did you think the person understood? Do you think they were treated with dignity? But also, what jumps out at you that each of the participants said? How are these, what's their attitude? What's their argument? What were the barriers you saw? So those kind of things. So next slide. So one of the reasons we timed this event to tonight is that we just released a stakeholder report. So about every 6 months, we will analyze the data that we've received and come up with a report. So what are the trends we're seeing? What's new? How does it compare to previous reports? And so that's part of what prompted tonight. But we want to talk about what's different and what's the same. And so some of the things that are different don't really have to do with the administration. And the biggest one is that we're seeing far fewer people in detention. And that really started because of COVID. And even the previous administration realized that people in detention are at risk. So they stopped really internal enforcement. So gone were the workplace raids, gone were all the targeted arrests, like we're going to stop people driving while brown and just ask for papers. So we were seeing a lot less of that. Biden came out with new enforcement guidelines that then got overturned by a court. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to explain all of this correctly. But then another decision said Biden did have the ability to create new enforcement guidelines. So there were interim ones, and final guidelines came out, which basically are prioritizing people who are deemed a threat to public safety or national security and recent border crossers. So we are seeing far fewer people in court than we used to. So we've gone from 6 half days of detained hearings to 1 half day a week of detained hearings. So from about 80, and I wrote this 7 to 8, but today there were like 13. So somewhere between 5 and 13 individuals will have these procedural hearings that's the heart and soul of our project. This enabled us, though, to expand what we're doing so that we now watch what's called hearings in the institutional hearing program. And I mentioned that earlier, but I didn't give it its name. And that's deportation hearings for people who are still being held in state or federal prison in Minnesota, who are being put into deportation proceedings. And we've expanded to merits hearings. So people have a lot of procedural hearings, similar to like arraignments in criminal court. And then they get to their merits hearing, which is akin to the trial, where there's testimony and evidence and a review of the case. And then the judge makes a determination whether this person is going to be deported or be allowed to stay under one of the very narrow relief options in this country. So now this is allowing us to watch things from start to finish. And we've learned a lot by expanding into these other kinds of hearings. The one really positive thing we have seen is that there's a slower pace of hearings. There's a rapid time frame. And by that, I mean that it used to be from somebody's first hearing to their final hearing might be 8 to 10 weeks because court schedules were very full. And now it might be as short as 3 or 4 weeks. But in an individual hearing, instead of doing rapid fire, and each hearing sometimes seemed like it was 5 or 6 minutes, we do see the judges taking more time to explain things. And that's a very big deal. Michelle, if you'd go to the next slide. One more second. We do ask people for a subjective rating of, did the judge explain things? Were the explanations understandable? And the last time we did report, and it's on a 1 to 5 scale. So no terrible to 5, yes, I agree. This was very understandable. And we went from a rating of 3.57 to 4.08. I don't know why. It could be that, we have new volunteers who just have a rosier sense. But my intuition is that the judges are taking more time. We have anecdotal information that the judges are allowing for better interpretation and explaining things better. And that benefits the people who are going through proceedings. So you could do the next slide, Michelle. And there goes my dog. So this is just showing how many people were in detention in Minnesota, sort of week to, or month to month, I should really say. And you can see that it just went way down. And then we had some really recent spikes because, in general, we've seen people who are arrested in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. We are now getting some transfers from the border because most of the ICE enforcement action is happening at the border and there's not space. So people who are not destined to live in Minnesota, who have no connections in Minnesota, are being shipped up here for their initial hearings, and if released, are getting sent to wherever in the country they have sponsors. So so there was a spike in July and August, and we have a spike right now. But in general, the numbers have gone way down in terms of the Minnesota detention population. You can go to the next slide.
While I'm doing that, I think it's that really relates to the border situations. And right now you've all seen kind of the horror show with Haitians down, the mistreatment of Haitians down at the southern border. And we saw people moved up here where we have extra bed space to make more room for detention of people down at the border. So it is all part of a big nationwide system that doesn't really matter where you live or where your community is.
And I will say, though, that we have not seen Haitians here because most of them have been expelled because, again, the darker your skin, the quicker you're out of here. And I know that sounds crass, but it's painfully true in terms of what we see in court. I didn't think this slide was next, so I'm going to have you go back and just say a couple more things, and then we'll pop to this slide that has the drawing. Yeah. I did want to give some examples of where I feel like we are actually having some impact. So we gave, at the beginning of COVID, we gave some feedback to the court that because there was a loss of interpreters and the respondents in the courtroom, so everything was being done by video or just phone through a speaker in the ceiling, and there were shortcuts in interpretation. So we actually went to the court and said, this is problematic. The interpretation is not being comprehensive. And they worked on that. And we are definitely seeing that they are slowing down so that there's comprehensive interpretation. We have seen a big change, or I think a big change in terms of the way the court perceives us. So we went from seeing people to judges saying, there's observers here, you don't have to let them in because we're going to talk about private things. Do you want them in or not? To the judge saying, there's observers in the court from community organizations. They make sure due process rights are upheld and the court remains transparent. Are you comfortable having court observers present for your hearing? So it's sort of giving us the credibility to be there. Like, these people are on your side. That is something we never heard until recently. And instead of saying you have a right to an attorney, but that's optional, do you want time to find an attorney? They're at least saying things like, the attorney can tell you your options. The attorney can help you prepare. So while it's still egregious that people are not given an attorney, the judges are being a little more thorough to say, this is what the proceedings are about. This is what my role is. You have a right to attorney. A little bit about how that might help them and how hard they'll have to try to get one, but that they'll be given time. And so we're seeing more people taking that time. Despite how horrible it is to be detained, we're seeing people take the time because they understand more what they're up against. So I think that's what I want to say about some of the improvements we've seen, but I'd like to turn it over to a couple observers. So Sharon, I'm going to have you just share a little bit about your experience.
Well, thank you, Amy. So I'm Sharon Castle, and I've been observing, it'll be 2 years in January. And most recently, the hearings that I've observed have been the IHP, which I think is an institutional hearing program. So it's immigrants who are incarcerated for criminal cases. And one of the things that I kept hearing over and over again was the detainee would say that my caseworker says I can't call an attorney. And the judge would say, you just have to keep calling, you have to keep calling. And in one case, the detainee said, well, the attorney called back, but nobody came and got him. I was hearing this a number of times that they were having trouble reaching out to an attorney, which I think is probably not just for immigrants, but the extra layer for immigrants in detention who are also incarcerated is that they need two attorneys. They need the criminal case attorney, and then they need the immigration attorney. And so one of the cases, what I found really encouraging was that I was walking out of the courtroom after one of these cases, and the judge stopped me and he said, I keep hearing this. Can you tell the organization that you work for that this is happening? And I just felt that he felt comfortable reaching out to us, and that I was able to then pass that along to Amy, and so that they could address that, so that because it doesn't do any good if they can't reach an attorney. They write to an attorney. So I felt really good about that. Thank you.
Thank you. And Michelle, because this went up the chain some, do you want to just say a little bit about the DOC working group?
Yeah.
This is where all these parts are starting to come together and be able to make some things happen.
Yeah, that's so true. One of the things that we've been able to do currently is work with the Minnesota State Department of Corrections in an ongoing dialogue that we're part of, and you can reach out to them directly. There's some great points of contact, and they've really made an effort at DOC to be building a relationship with people outside the department so we can solve problems. And this was one area where we were able to go to the commissioner's office and say, what's going on? And it's not just, I have a problem with it. The immigration court itself is unable to do its business because of your policies. And we haven't gotten everything untangled yet, but the department readily admitted that they just don't have a system set up to let people get lawyers while they're in custody. It assumes you come in with your criminal defense attorney and you can stay in contact with that person, but getting a new person for an unrelated matter, they're just not equipped to do. So that's something, it'll take time because we have to go facility by facility, and there's all sorts of complexity to it, but we know we can solve that. And that's something that we would have never known was a problem if Sharon hadn't been in that courtroom that day. It's just really important to be able to solve things like our executive director always says, with the lowest level of intervention. Let's solve the problem before we have to start escalating it up to something much more aggressive. So very, very pleased with that. And it's part of that overall connection. And I also noticed Florence had a comment. Amy, I don't know if you were able to see this.
I did see that, that sometimes the judge will reach out to the observers in the courtroom and say, would you guys help find this person an attorney? In fact, that happened this morning, apparently, for some people in court. Sometimes respondents, the migrants in detention, don't understand the importance of an attorney. Sometimes they mix up, if they had an attorney for their criminal case, that person can't represent them, or they had somebody for their bond case, but they need somebody else for the removal case. And sometimes they don't speak a language that anybody else speaks, and the only time anybody can speak to them in their language is when they have an interpreter in the courtroom. And so there have been many times where the judge will say, hey, you court observers, can you help facilitate that? And we can't guarantee that we can get somebody, but we can guarantee that we can write up what we know about the case, reach out to the attorneys at the advocates and our other collaborative partners, and they can at least do an intake and see if they can represent somebody, or give them some advice and send them materials to help them be able to fight their case on their own. And it's part of why I believe the court is so receptive to us being there, because at least in this court, they really want people to be given a fair chance. And without an attorney, you don't really have a fair chance. And so if we can help facilitate that, they're so grateful that they will sometimes flag, like, this person really needs somebody. So thanks for bringing that up, Florence. I'd like to ask Susan to share a little bit about your experience.
Sure. I'm Sue Cook. I've been volunteering for about a year. I thought at first I'd just say a couple things that surprised me over this year for those of you who aren't already doing it, or see if yours are similar. One was, I was surprised at the percentage of people who don't have representation. When you're not in this world, you want to believe that the system is actually at least somewhat pretending to be fair. And finding out that there are so many people who don't have representation is kind of a shock. A second one was the level of hopelessness that you see amongst some people. It is heart-wrenching when you watch a person decide to go ahead and ask to be deported, or in some other way turn back some avenue of possible relief because they cannot stand being detained anymore, or they need to go, even if it's in Mexico, they need to go work to send money to their family, that kind of stuff. And then a third thing is how personality driven the law process is. I would never have guessed the range of judges and how their courtrooms would work, their treatment of the process, their treatment of the people. I just thought that, I mean, when you read the law, it's so specified, you can't believe that there's any wiggle room in there, but it's huge, the amount of difference from one judge to another in terms of how people are treated. And then a fourth surprise for me as a former project manager and a designer of project management systems is how darn inefficient the process is. If you haven't been there to watch people having, especially when we were still meeting in person, they have hauled people from all over the state to come here. They've known in advance what language the person speaks. They know what they're going to do. And they get in there and it appears that no one has looked at this until just this moment, and it never occurred to them to so there's constantly, oh, well, we're just going to have to do it again in 2 weeks and we'll call you and all that kind of stuff. And you're just, really, how much money did we just spend? And moreover, back when things were busy, how much of the judge's time did we just spend, and what a good project manager could do to overhaul that system. So that one was just a surprise for me personally. And I guess I would just say in closing that, what has this experience done to me so far is that it's really reminded me that this system, while we're talking about immigration reform, this system is really set up to do exactly what it's doing, which is to make sure that wealthy people and people who own things can continue to live the lives they want and not be worried about ever losing their jobs or their money or having to look at people that they don't know how to talk to or anything like that. And it's really shoved my attention more towards the big system questions of capitalism and classism in this country, and seeing immigration as just one of the systems that is maintaining, at what cost to how many of us are we doing that to maintain an economic system that reproduces these relationships? It doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or a Republican, it just doesn't change that much for the bad or the good. But so that's been something for me personally that I've had to look at a lot more, about getting comfortable reading about capitalism and understanding my economic system that I support and pay taxes to, and what the impacts of that are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. And our system is in so many ways designed to exploit low-skilled workers with the fear of deportation. If we had a more welcoming system and we had pathways to citizenship for people who are undocumented, they couldn't be so exploited. So it is. Thank you for bringing that point up. I'll say a brief thing about the drawing you've been seeing, which is that under COVID, everything was remote. Things have changed a little bit. So now observers are sitting in the courtroom, typically with the government attorney and the judge, and then the migrant is on a video screen. But in the institutional hearing program, so the ones where people are serving a criminal sentence, until their final hearing for all the procedural ones, they're not even entitled to a video. So they're hearing sounds coming over a speaker or a headset. They have no idea which person's talking and who the people are that are even participating, which is a huge due process concern. And somehow it seems that the government attorneys are afraid of people who are in jail because they don't show up for these. So there's still a disembodied voice over the loudspeaker, and the judge is sitting in the courtroom. So that's just something to ponder. If we could have the next slide, or the one that says what hasn't changed. Go back. You're going forward. Go back. So I want to say something that wasn't even on a slide, which is one of the big things that hasn't changed is Title 42 expulsion. So Title 42 is something that really gives the president some authority to protect, in cases of public health emergencies. And Trump invoked it as a way to not let the normal asylum process play out. So instead of people being allowed to show up at a border and say, I feel fear persecution, I want to apply for asylum, and then they'd be entitled to a hearing, they're just being expelled. And I think when so many people showed up at the border, Biden decided to keep that in place. And that has been an affront to all the advocates who were expecting, and all the asylum seekers who were expecting a more humane policy that he had promised. So that's affecting who we do see in court, because so many people are not being let in. And we've seen that in a big way with the Haitians who sort of came in a wave and were not given any due process rights. But in terms of what we're seeing in court, we're seeing the same due process concerns. People don't have access to counsel. There are tremendous language barriers, and that's, they're given an interpreter, or they're supposed to be given an interpreter in the language they understand the best for their hearing, but there's nobody to help them when they're doing any of their paperwork. There's no translation services. Nobody says, so they're given an application, fill this out in English, return it in English, and they may not have any idea what it even asks them, and then they have no way to get it translated when they write it up. We continue to see detention as a very coercive force. For those who don't know, detention is not considered punishment. It's civil detention just so people show up at their hearing. But of course, if you ask anybody who's been detained by ICE, it is very much punishment. It's coercive, it's dehumanizing, it's demoralizing, and it's stressful on their families. And everything was made worse by COVID. More time in lockdown, harder to access the telephone, harder to get mail through, harder to communicate with families, harder to feel like you can endure the risks of being detained. One thing that started with COVID that has not improved, and it should have improved by now, is all the technical problems with the video hearings. Just today, the screen was frozen and you hear all this clanging and you can't tell if somebody's sitting there. And the judge, in a very undignified way, because what else can you do, says, are you there? Are you there? Hello, is somebody there? Is that the guard? Is that, it's very demoralizing. So in our report, let me see where that is. Observers have said the frozen screen doesn't allow a person's humanity. Sometimes the judge, couldn't even tell if the person was there or not. How does that uphold human dignity? So to hear somebody plead for sometimes mercy and a second chance, and for the judge not to even be able to see a person's face, that's pretty inexcusable. As Sue mentioned, people give up. And every time we write a report, this one included, we share some of the stories about the people who've built lives here and cannot bear being detained. And they say, deport me. Somebody said recently, it would have been easier to fill out applications for relief from deportation if I had been given bond. Since I've been denied bond, I want to be deported. It's very difficult for me to be locked up here. I'm very anxious here. If I can't apply for relief from the outside, I want to leave. And somebody else just, my family's hungry. They have to eat. I have to work. Send me back. Very powerful. And one thing, unfortunately, that has not changed is the role and the behavior of the government attorneys. So for people who don't know, the government attorneys are employees of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And with new enforcement guidelines that are basically saying, we don't have the resources to deport everybody who's undocumented in this country or who's violated our laws. We need to focus on people who are a national security threat or threats to public safety. We expected that the government attorneys would be more lenient, more flexible, more open to negotiation, more more open to the discretion that judges would want to show, and we have not seen that. So we added recently some questions on our form to look at the role and the behavior of government attorneys. And one thing that's loud and clear is they often just sit silently and participate not at all. And they really should be proving a case, even when, like for bond, the migrant has the burden of proof to kind of show that they're not a danger and that they will show up again. The government is really supposed to build a case for why they disagree with that and for why this person is deportable. But often, so for almost 70% of the time where we ask this question, they did not speak at all. Next slide. We also looked at what they said when they did speak. And the most common thing that they did was, I object to giving them more time. We gave them time to find an attorney. Now we just have to move ahead. And Sharon shared how hard it is for somebody to make contact with an attorney. And then if they do, they might have to, reach 7 different people before they can find somebody who can represent them. And so there's no reason we don't give people time to find an attorney. But the majority of the time when a government attorney was speaking, they were like, don't give them any more time. Or they'd say a variation of that, which is, you gave them the paperwork to fill out. If it's not back the next time, then we should just deport them. They don't get another chance. If they didn't fill it out, they couldn't find a translator, then consider it abandoned and deport them. So rarely were they really sort of justifying their case. And if they justify it at all, it was to just say, well, these are all the convictions, or I think the person has a bad moral character. And one thing, and we're just getting some of this in writing, but a lot of what they'll do, and we see this especially with driving under the influence or domestic violence, is instead of looking individually, they will just hand the judge a standard packet. They have standard packets about 70 pages long with statistics, as if any person who goes through court just meets all the statistics. So instead of doing an individualized assessment or argument, they just hand the judge these standard, and they'll say that, I handed you the standard DUI packet, I handed you the standard domestic violence packet. As if they've done their due diligence. So this is something we're looking at, and we're dismayed that it hasn't changed. Next slide. The other thing we look at is bond appeals. So there's a little circle that says DHS, and there's a little circle that's respondent. And I just want to focus on the DHS side. So if somebody requests a bond, they get a bond hearing. The judge might find that they weren't eligible for a bond because of some criminal conviction or because they just came to the country and they're considered an arriving alien. But otherwise, if the judge makes a decision, we looked at when the judge did grant a bond, how often did the government attorney appeal it? And the answer is basically 60% of the time. So that means it gets pushed up to a higher court to review the appeal. So instead of trusting that the judge did due diligence, they are still operating in this, we are just going to appeal everything you do. And we're not saying that. I don't have data from the last few months, but anecdotally, I'd say that their behavior has not changed, even though, our enforcement priorities are to be such that we're not just aiming to deport every person we can. We're just not seeing that.
And if I could jump in on that, historically, that was not the case. There was not an appeal of every decision that went in favor of the respondent or the person seeking relief. Often it was customary that appeal would be waived in most cases and would be raised, only where the government really thought that they needed to do so. And that was a change that we saw take place, and agree, it's dismaying to see, over many, many years, that was more of the practice. And now we have shifted away from that.
Yeah. And that was definitely a directive. I mean, we heard maybe 2 years ago, so not at the very beginning of the Trump administration where they were still coming up with all their heinous plans, but we literally heard the government attorneys saying, no, we're going to appeal everything. I mean, that's our directive. We're going to oppose every continuance, and we're going to basically appeal almost every decision. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that change at this point, which is very dismaying. The other thing I just want to say is that Trump put a lot of people on the the Board of Immigration Appeals, and that has not really had turnover under President Biden. And so that's leading to a lot of these bad decisions from the Bureau of Immigration Appeals to the Board of Immigration Appeals. And so we're, it makes judges more cautious. They'll say, well, I got overturned, so I'm going to deny the bond this time, or I'm not going to exercise this discretion. And so that's harming people that under a more favorable BIA might have a better chance. So, and what's the next slide, Michelle? I think I might be turning that back to you. Do we want to do some Q&A?
Yes, we can open that up. And I think these were the recommendations, sort of in a global sense, that we really want to be thinking about when we looked at the Immigration Court Observation Project about a year ago, and looked at the project as a whole, not just one snapshot of time. One of the things we really set out to do was to try to understand sort of the guiding principles of what was wrong and what did observers expect from an immigration justice system, and what were we seeing or not seeing. And these core recommendations of making sure that the laws are just in the first place, that they do justice, that we can forgive where we want to forgive as a community. We can allow people to stay in community and not disrupt them. These values would be just, and that's one point that needs to happen. Another, that if we say this is a process of law, it needs to respect due process and have not just sort of the trappings of a podium and a gavel, but to have the ability to actually hear and for a person to be heard and understood and to have a fair day in court, that we wouldn't see the constant amplification of racial bias that we see in the immigration detention system. And I'm going to be curious as we go into the next reporting period where we've had a chance to see many more hearings in the institutional hearing program, many more hearings of people who are in prison in Minnesota, North and South Dakota, what that looks like in terms of racial bias, because these are people who would never have made it to immigration court. They wouldn't be released and then go to immigration court. This is all happening while they're still in criminal custody. And I think we really need to be looking at that system of incarceration that drives the immigration deportation machine. And then the basic value, like what are we trying to achieve with immigration policy? Sue, you talked about this. What is the system designed to do? And it is doing what we built it to do. And you hit the nail on the head with that we can't expect anything different out of the system that we have we can't expect it to do respect human dignity if we don't design it to do so. And so that rebuilding remains, something that as we continue to look for immigration justice, where, things are in play in Congress and in the administration, and always think about that. Is it going to promote human dignity, or is it going to erode that and further entrench injustice? So I'm going to go ahead with the controls here, so people can feel free to unmute yourselves, or if you prefer it, you want to type a question into the chat, go ahead and do that. But do we have any questions for people about either the program, the project itself, or about what we've been finding or experiencing, or something that you want to share as an observer about your experience that you think it's important for us to reflect on as we kind of wrap up 2021 court observations. And feel free to go ahead and just unmute yourself and start your question. And I will try to get the full screen on so I can see people if you move around, but I'm watching the chat as well. So
your question or your comment, because there are a lot of observers on. And if you disagree with anything I said about what's new or what's not new, or you have an anecdote to share, I'd love to hear that.
And we do see some of our observers are well trained to observe and document. And I see many notes being taken amongst some of you professional observers out there. Peter, Frederick, I'm looking at you. But if there are questions, and people may have questions too about kind of what's going on with some of the rest of the immigration scene right now, because things are really in this is a critical moment as we're seeing the arrival of Afghan asylum seekers into the United States. So if there are questions about the system as a whole too, please feel free to let us know.
Well, since you brought it up, Michelle, I think it would be great for you to explain what the Advocates is doing with the Afghan nationals who were brought to Wisconsin.
Sure. Yeah.
Very impressive.
Right. Very, very, we all have seen the deteriorating conditions and people, literally fleeing to the airport out of Kabul and trying to get to the United States. In the departure has precipitated, well over 100,000 people from Afghanistan in just a very short period of time. Some have made it, several tens of thousands have made it to the United States onto U.S. military bases, and from there have started to move into resettlement sites, including Minnesota. The biggest base is just next door at Fort McCoy in Wisconsin, so down by La Crosse, and there are about 13,000 people there, including, I think, about 700 unaccompanied children who are part of that first wave. When that base clears, there will be another that they will refill with people who are waiting outside the U.S. We've started to see, and many of you may be involved with churches who do resettlement, with congregations who work on refugee resettlement, and may have already been kind of know this is starting, but people have begun to arrive in Minnesota. We expect to have capacity for about 2,000 new arrivals over the course of the evacuation. And there are some centralized spots, hotels where people are being housed while they wait for more permanent housing. And we've been really fortunate to work with our partners at the state of Minnesota and in resettlement to establish legal advice clinics on site there. This is important in this particular instance because unlike other refugee arrivals, these folks are coming in without refugee status. So everyone who is arriving now is either coming, already had some status and happened to be outside the US and got evacuated, or is being paroled into the United States. The system is called humanitarian parole. It's an emergency permission to enter the US, and it's being granted for 2 years and 2 years only. At the end of that time, if we haven't figured out something systemically and given everyone a chance to apply for green cards, or if people haven't applied for individual asylum cases, their status will end and they will end up being deported back to Afghanistan. So we have to act really quickly. People have to file their claims for asylum within a year of arrival in the United States in general. So we're scrambling to make sure that everybody who we come in contact with knows what their status is, has a game plan, and that we can provide asylum representation to everyone in that. Because the reality is that if we don't deal with this effectively right now, in 15 years, 20 years, we'll be seeing the people who slipped through the cracks of this arrival in deportation proceedings. I was reflecting just recently on one of my clients from years ago who was in her 90s-ish, we think, when she was out at immigration court. The judge made me wave to her in court to come over and I'd help her. And she had been an elder in the Hmong community who just like nobody ever quite got her papers done. And she was in deportation proceedings. And, that was years after people had come in resettlement. This is going to be an even bigger mess because we aren't making sure everyone has status at the get-go. Other questions?
Somebody wrote a question, so I want to address it because it says, what kind of direct sharing of the project are shared with judges? Are observations shared with specifics about concerns observed? And could there be intentional regular dialogue established? And so I have very good news about that, which is, first of all, there is regular dialogue established. So I participate we keep calling it quarterly, but it seems to be every other month, with the pro bono group of attorneys. So it's people from Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid, South Dakota Voices for Peace, Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, the Binger Center for New Americans. It could be some of the other law schools, and of course the advocates. And so, and I sort of play the role of, I'm going to raise this concern and make this criticism. I'm not a lawyer. Maybe I have this wrong, so that I'm in a position to sometimes give some pretty pointed feedback or critique that lawyers who have to appear before these judges might not feel comfortable doing. And we do some collaborating in advance sometimes, so I know sort of what needs to be poked. But also, there have been times where an observer will send me a case and say, I really have concerns about how this was done. And I can confidentially write to Judge Wood, who's the assistant chief immigration judge for this region. And if I give a name and a date and a case number, he will actually listen to the recording, and he will always write me back and say, thank you for sending this. I will listen to the case and I will do coaching as necessary. That's a confidential thing. So he's not going to say, I said this and they said this, but I always get a response, and Judge Wood takes it very seriously. When we did our bearing witness report, which was really sort of asking all the observers, what is your perception of what you're seeing? What do you think works? What's broken? Including what advice would you like to give to the judges? It was a very hard read because it was basically saying you're not treating people with dignity. He required all the judges to read it, and they had a conversation about it. And we did see some changes, as I said, judges even explaining what our purpose is in court. So is it perfect? No. And every now and then I think, I pushed a little too hard. I have to back off now. But we really do have a regular avenue to say these are concerns that are being raised by observers, and confidentially to say this is a case that warrants review. So I think we're just trying to continue building on that relationship. I have not sent just the data analysis to them. We don't hide it. They might find it on the website, but I haven't directly sent that. And it's really intended for court observers and other people who do court observation projects. So,
Amy, you could use the example about the translation. I thought that was just a remarkable turnaround. Like 1 week, judges were not being very careful about that everything got translated and that time was given to the translator to get it all in there before moving on to the next week. And Amy made a report about that, and it was like night and day. They were all of a sudden completely on that, just berating attorneys who didn't give time for the people to translate something or everything. It was really quick and in marked change.
And I think this really brings us to the what can change, what stays the same when we have a framework that is so fundamentally flawed. We have an immigration court that is a system that has 330 judges nationwide and a 1.5 million case backlog. When we've made strategic decisions to invest billions of dollars into 50,000 active enforcement personnel and 330 judges, right? So there are some things that are not changing at all. And that's incredibly frustrating. There are opportunities always at the congressional level to try to raise things, and there are politics that get in the way. So we saw that even with this, most sympathetic of Afghan resettlement discussions just a few weeks ago, when we couldn't get to a good resolution because of politics and because of a lack of political will on all sides of the aisle to really prioritize immigration justice. The fact that DACA students and TPS holders are still hoping that they will get permanent residence during the after a year of work and decades of advocacy. This is a fundamental problem, but at the same time, we can't just sit by and let the system degenerate further. And so these on the ground interventions to make a real difference in people's lives. And by doing both, by working at the individual level, by working with our local court, and by documenting and pushing so that we can really see where the system failures are, we hope that we're transforming the system for better. And we are so glad that we're not alone in that. This project demonstrates the strength of numbers, of direct witness, of the ability to really see what is going on and demand better for our country in a system that would be behind the curtain for most of us if you didn't get in your car and go down to the Whipple building or jump on the train and do that. We need to be doing that every day at all levels. So thank you for being part of that. Thank you, Sue and Sharon, and most of all, Amy, and Charlie, I should say. We had one yip from our most fierce advocate for human rights, Charlie, the Yorkshire Terrier, for this evening, for coming together and just helping us reflect on where we are and where we have to go. This is not over. We have a big challenge ahead of us. We are also, of course, at the Advocates in the midst of our virtual series for the fall. So please join us for future events. We will be having those coming up. Our next is on the 22nd with our book club that happens at noon Central Time. And you can find, I think we've got a link in here to the events. Up here it comes. Thanks, Liz. The advocatesforhumanrights.org fall 21 to register for any of the other events. We'll have a more in-depth look at this situation with the Afghan arrivals and the human rights situation more broadly with our entire team in a few weeks, and events throughout November and, of course, into December for International Human Rights Day. And again, this work is not, it doesn't happen by itself. And we really need support from people like you to make it possible for us to be out at immigration court, to have our lawyers out at the jails, to make sure that we have that legal clinic up and operating, to make, to avoid problems in the future and make our newest arrivals feel like they have a home in our community. We encourage you to donate to help us protect human rights for immigrants, refugees, and for all of us in our community. Thank you so much for being here. And
Michelle?
Peter, yes.
May I just thank you and Amy for your work. I mean, it doesn't happen, we're not able to do what we do without you guys doing and setting it up as you do. I'm feeling depressed now with one piece of information, which is I did not know that there were still Trump people on the BIA. That changes everything when a judge says, "Oh, go ahead and appeal. Please appeal." Or in one case that I observed in late August into September. That one was just disgusting on the judge's part, and the appeal will go to a bunch of Trump people. So I'm not heartened, but we got to keep working at it. But we got to keep working at it because the Sue, you nailed it with your global look at the inherent unfairness of the whole system. And what what we're facing, what you're facing with immigration court? Is it the same? How much is it changed? Is it better? Well, it's from 4.87 to 5.3. You know, that doesn't tell me a thing when I watch the judge do the same thing over and over again and send people away who came here as with LPRs at age 5 or 10 and are now being deported to a country they've never lived in because they have an addiction, not because they're criminals. Saw 2 of them, and in the second one, the judge, she'll go nameless. The judge spent an hour on looking good with an oral discretionary analysis of the case, which was almost totally in favor of relief for that respondent. And turned out we didn't know that she'd already signed a deportation order.
Peter, you're so right. This is the time that we have to, just continue and stay the course on holding people accountable, on building a better system, and expecting more, not just from others, but from ourselves in making human rights a reality for those in our community. We've reached the end of the hour here, and I'm so glad to see you all. Thank you again. And